guys, welcome back to the StudyTube channel. Today's video is going to be a relatively short and sweet one actually, but it's something that I wanted to talk about a little bit, just as a little sort of like one-off topic basically. If you didn't know, my name is Eve and I study German and Spanish at the University of Oxford, and so as you can tell I am a linguist and a lot of my degree involves translation. Translation is a really bizarre one because I think there are so many different views of translation, especially these days because we have like machines that can essentially do it for us. And so I wanted to talk about whether translation is an art or whether it is a science. There are definitely arguments for both, and I just wanted to touch on both and see what you guys think, because it is a really interesting topic and I would love to do some more videos specific to German and Spanish, like words that can't be translated or like things about the language that are really interesting to English speakers. So if you would like me to do that, then definitely give this a thumbs up, but this is just more of a general overview. According to the dictionary, translation is the activity or process of changing the words of one language into the words of another language that have the same meaning. So essentially, if I say I walked the dog, then that is a case of translating that sentence, I walked the dog, into whichever other language and getting the meaning exactly the same, so that a person in Japan and a person in England would both be understanding the same situation from the words on the page. But when you put a sentence into Google Translate, obviously maybe not as simple as I walked the dog, it might mean the same thing in the other language, but it doesn't mean the same thing in the other language, as in it's translated literally from one into the other, but to the person in the new language, they may be sat scratching their head because the word could be right in some contexts, but totally wrong in that context. Translation is a career that requires like a deep knowledge of the language and like a very, very refined technique, like a science, but it also requires a degree of freedom and spontaneity, but I'll get into this. So with the growing tendency of increasingly intelligent translation machines taking over the jobs of translators, there are a lot of people arguing, wow, really bad language for me there are a lot of people arguing that human translators will soon not be needed at all, which I couldn't agree less with, and I shall tell you why eventually in this video. But first, let's talk about why some people do see it as nothing more than a science. So essentially, it could be said to be a form of science because at the end of the day, many people would argue that it can be done by machines. Things like Reverso, Babylon, Google Translate can translate documents literally in the press of a button, and yes, most documents like legal documents and things can be understood by the speaker in the new language. Science is about facts and it fundamentally relies on accuracy, as does translation. You need to know the grammar of the language, you need to know both languages, you need to understand the way that the syntax works and the way that verbs are inflected and everything like that. And at the end of the day, most translations, one would argue, should just be as exact as possible. As in, if one is describing a car driving down the road in a desert, the other one should be describing a car driving down the road in the desert, and both readers should be getting the same idea in their heads. A lot of people would argue that translations should be unbiased as well, and that it's not your own work, you are trying to convey another person's work in a new language, and so a translator should try and work without, you know, putting their own ideas and opinions into the work, because then it would just be a totally different work and you wouldn't be translating, you would be adapting, and that wouldn't be conveying the same image. Also, it's a technique that can be refined over and over. It's like a craft almost, you know, like it's like carpentry, like you get better at it over time and you can really hone it, but you could also apply that principle to the arts as well, just saying. But whilst machines use really intelligent algorithms to create translations that are by all means passable in the new language and like will probably be understood at the rate that the machines are working, at the end of the day, it still needs a human person to edit and check that, which is what stops it from being like a completely mechanical, refined, scientific process, as it were. A machine translation will lack soul, it will lack rhythm, it will lack just a basic concept of the nuances of everyday speech and everyday language, because what a dictionary tells you is not what's being spoken in bars and clubs and restaurants up and down a given country. So let's talk about why translation can't be an exact science. How can translation be an exact science when no two cultures are the same? So take a translation from English to German, for example. If we were translating an episode of Gavin and Stacey where they talk about a fish supper, the concept of going to your local chip shop and getting chips all wrapped up in paper and taking it home and having it out those little polystyrene boxes is something well known to the Brits. We understand. And if someone says, are you going to the chippy, or are you going to get chips, or like, are you getting fish supper, we understand the cultural reference that is making like specific reference to. How do we translate that into German? Because if we translate it as a fish supper, they're gonna picture like, you know, like a plate of like lovely, you know, like sea bass, and, you know, like really like a completely different thing to the actual cultural practice that we're talking about, because that cultural practice does not exist in Germany. And so do you focus on translating it literally and getting them to understand the concept of a fish supper, or do you take some liberties and translate it into a similar cultural reference that Germans would understand? For example, like getting a doner kebab, or like something similar, like a snack bar, or something that they would get, because fish and chips isn't as widespread in Germany as it is in England, you know? So there, ultimately, you would need a human to make that final call. It's not something that a robot could do, because a robot would just say fish supper. Similarly, the boundaries are blurred. So, for example, the Japanese word for blue encompasses a lot of colours that English speakers would understand to be green. And so at that point, what sort of blue are we talking about here? How would a robot know exactly what sort of blue? There is no right or wrong answer there. It's not like, you know, a scientific or mathematical value that's either right or it's wrong. It's a question of interpretation and of understanding. There are also words in some languages that don't exist in another language. So for example, Kummerspeck, which means grief bacon. So that's a German word, and that basically means weight that you gain from like emotionally overeating after something really bad happened. And so obviously we have that concept in English, like everyone knows Bridget Jones sat there with her ice cream, but how do we translate grief bacon? We can't say grief bacon, because who the hell is going to understand that? Or sobremesa in Spanish basically means the time that you spend socializing, like over a meal. And obviously that's such an intrinsic part of Hispanic culture. Like, food is so deeply connected with social events, way more so than in England. And how would we translate that concept into English without making like sentences and sentences trying to explain the cultural phenomenon that is? The same thing goes with understanding ingrained ideals and cultural values and idiomatic nuances that mean that something that literally means something also to most native speakers will not mean that. The best example I can think of is American Airlines. Oh, this actually makes me laugh so much. So their slogan in English is fly in leather. So in Spanish that's vuela en cuero, which does literally mean fly in leather, but cuero and like a lot of idiomatic phrases that go around that phrase basically means naked. So they translated fly in leather. Yes, that's literally what it means, but the idiom means to fly naked. So how would you translate a slogan like that when the literal meaning will always get mistaken for the idiomatic meaning? There needs to be an artist, because they need to think of ways to get around this, to communicate the meaning that they're trying to understand, aka flying in a stylish leather seat, rather than imagining somebody literally flying through the air with their genitals hanging out. A lot of people will argue that a work of translated literature or anything is essentially, you know, an original work, in that it will never be exactly the same. Even if the literal words remain similar, you've got to think about the style, the tone, the cultural nuances that are going to be infused into that text. Obviously less so for like legal documents and like manuals and stuff. They're much more sort of like matter of fact. But think about any other piece of literature, whether it's like advertising or like novels or plays or TV shows, they're always going to be slightly different. They're always going to have to require some degree of creativity by the translator. You need to be able to convey the exact cultural meaning taken from the target language with all the ease and flowiness and rhythm of the new language, essentially. So there's so much to think about, and every single translator will do that differently. That's why if you look at any given novel, and there are going to be 3 or 4 translations of it that all read slightly differently, and any English speaker that reads a Spanish novel will get a slightly different feel for what that book's about depending on which translator they pick, because it is at the end of the day a subjective art. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was basically like not really like learning anything, but it is just something to think about when you're thinking about translation. It's not just as easy as putting, you know, words into Google Translate and hoping that it all comes out okay. So I hope that you enjoyed this video nonetheless. Let me know if you have any requests for videos that you'd like me to do. I definitely am going to do a video on Don Quixote. That is next on my list of things to do. If you would like me to do that in Spanish, then do let me know, because I could definitely do it in Spanish. I could give it a go at least, and obviously subtitle it. But yeah, that's all from me today. I hope you're enjoying your week and that you're holding up okay. Stay safe, and we'll see you very soon for a new video on the StyleTube project. Bye guys.